Three Buccaneers are starting on an NFL dream team. Jimmy Garoppolo could be moving, and if he does, Tom Brady and the Bucs might see him twice this season. And two veteran cornerbacks are at risk for losing their job this training camp. All of that coming right now on the Locked On Bucs podcast.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bucs Nation? Welcome to the Locked On Bucs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We are free and we are available on all platforms, including YouTube. And we thank you for making us your first listen or your first view of the day. I am David Harrison, writer for BucsGameDay.com, part of Sports Illustrated's family of sites. My partner, James Yarcho, the deputy editor of BucsNation.com, over on SB Nation, is not here for this episode, but you can find him on Twitter at @JYarcho_Bucs. You can find me at DHarrison82 and find the show at Locked On Bucs. We thank you again for making us your first listener, first view of the day. Three Tampa Bay Buccaneers would start on what I'm dubbing an NFL dream team. Although it is not quite a dream team, because if you were alive to remember the actual dream team back in the 90s, there was no salary cap. So this is more of an ideal NFL team because the salary cap rules did apply. They did stay in place when Anthony Holtzman Escareno of NFL.com got to work constructing the best roster that he could assemble while staying under the given dollar amount, again, the NFL salary cap. And we're going to start this off. Three Buccaneers made the starting roster that Escareno put together there at NFL.com. And again, I wrote this up for BucsGameDay.com as well if you want to check out the written work. But we're starting it off with quarterback Tom Brady, and it's fitting, really. It's just kind of poetic justice, I think, that on this show in the last week or so, we've talked about Chris Sims ranking Tom Brady as his eighth quarterback out of 40, out of his top 40 here for the 2022 NFL season. We took the stance that Tom underrated on that. Of course, we did have one listener call in disagree with our take on that. That's fine, but here you see Escareno making Tom Brady his starting quarterback in his ideal roster. Not Josh Allen, not Patrick Mahomes, not Lamar Jackson, Aaron Rodgers, Justin Herbert, none of those guys. Tom Brady. And Escareno wrote, quote, after working through situations with Josh Allen and Justin Herbert in this spot, then pairing each with Tom Brady, the obvious became apparent. The obvious became apparent, Holtzman Escareno wrote. Continuing, the greatest team money can buy in 2022 needed the greatest quarterback in NFL history. Not only does Brady have more Super Bowl rings than any player, head coach, or franchise, but he also led the NFL in passing yards with 5,316 and touchdowns with 43 last season as the youngest 44-year-old you've ever seen. And since joining the Buccaneers in 2020, Brady leads the NFL in deep pass completions. Deep passes are 20-plus air yards with 57. End quote. So Tom Brady, the number one quarterback, according to James Yarcho, David Harrison, and Holtzman Escareno, again, they're at NFL.com. Now, he wasn't done adding Buccaneers to the starting lineup just yet. He also added right tackle Tristan Wirfs, writing, quote, Tristan Wirfs has been an elite starting right tackle since entering Tampa Bay's lineup in week one of his 2020 rookie season. The 2021 first-team All-Pro, who was PFF's sixth highest graded offensive tackle last season, has yet to miss a regular season game in his career, end quote. Unfortunately, of course, Wirfs did miss the playoff game against the Los Angeles Rams, and I think you could make a case that absence a very big reason why the Buccaneers eventually lost that game, could not defend their Super Bowl title successfully. But Tristan on the mend, looking healthy, should be back for this season, obviously, looking to get things back in the groove. And it's still just amazing me, guys, if you go back to that 2020 NFL draft that you remember, there were four big tackles, right? Andrew Thomas, obviously Tristan Wirfs was one of them. And then you had two others, Mekhi Becton and Jedrick Wills, for the Cleveland Browns. I can remember all those. Right off the top of my head, I thought I could, but it's just amazing. And I remember we all kind of mocked Andrew Thomas. We figured Andrew Thomas would be the fourth. I think Wirfs we had as the second, I think that's where we had him. And lo and behold, Wirfs ends up coming down to the Buccaneers, a trade up there with John Lynch and San Francisco 49ers to secure the pick. But the fourth tackle taken off the board turns out to be the best one, and all pro in his second season. And Tristan has certainly been a great part of the team. So more than deserving here of being on this NFL ideal roster for 2022. The third starter, we're moving over to the defensive side of the ball. Defensive tackle Vita Vea, and Holtzman Escarena wrote, quote, "Big men aren't supposed to move like Vita Vea. The 6'4", 347-pound defensive tackle amassed a career-high 4 sacks in 2021 en route to his first Pro Bowl nod, and his 85.7 PFF pass rush grade since 2020 ranks 7th among interior defensive linemen," end quote. And yeah, Vita, we've heard this before, right? Vita Vea has been an impressive part of this defense since he got to the National Football League, even more so since the team moved to a 3-4, really kind of stuck him in that nose. And when you go back to offseason, NFL scouting combine comments made by the team that they want to get a better pass rush, better penetration from that front line. William Golson coming back, Logan Hall drafted in the second round. Hopefully we'll add to that a little bit, some rotational pieces potentially as well. And yeah, 4 sacks career high for Vita Vea last year. Not Aaron Donald numbers, but look, if he can continue to kind of improve, take those next steps, work on some of those pass rushing moves, no reason Vita Vea can't become the next great interior defensive tackle in the National Football League. So those were the starters. Those are the guys on the roster. Akiem Hicks was on the roster as well as a depth player, not a starter, but as a depth player. So good look there for him. Look, some Buccaneers that were considered for positions but didn't make the roster. Offensive linemen Shaq Mason and Ryan Jensen, both also considered here by the writer. Alex Kappa, now obviously a former Buck, now Cincinnati Bengal, but he was also considered as well. Cornerbacks Sean Murphy-Bunting and Jamel Dean considered for the cornerback position. Not considered for the cornerback position, Carlton Davis, the team's number 1 cornerback, not considered yet. Sean Murphy-Bunting and Jamel Dean were. I don't know, maybe when he got to corners, Carlton Davis was just way too expensive, so he couldn't consider him. But a little surprised to not see Carlton Davis's name there on the considerations for the starting lineup, at least here for this team. Also not considered, that are very surprising to me, linebacker Levante David, outside linebacker Shaquille Barrett, and safety Antoine Winfield Jr. So apparently Levante David, national hate, is back. Shaquille Barrett, 1 year removed from really kind of lighten up the NFL, apparently didn't keep that torch lit as much as maybe he wanted to. And then Antoine Winfield Jr., I get it. He's young. He, hasn't done huge things, I guess, from an NFL, from a nationwide landscape, but still a very good young safety either way. Just a little surprised not to see those guys considered for their position. So moving into segment 2, we're going to talk about the possible return of Jimmy Garoppolo into Tom Brady's competitive life. Not going to see him every day like they did back in New England, but they might see him. Tom Brady and the Buccaneers might see him more this year than they had bargained for. And we're going to talk about that thanks to our friends at betonline.net, your number 1 source for all your betting needs and sports information. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live bets, esports, and scores. And betonline.net remains your best spot for all your podcasts and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action at BetOnline, where the game starts. Today's episode also brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing number of makes and models of vehicles, it's impossible for your local chain auto parts store or your dealership to stock all the parts you're ever going to need. While the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the brand for you that they just happen to carry because they either get a deal or they get paid to carry those brands. You have a computer or you have access to a computer to save time and money by using rockauto.com. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts at that chain store or car dealership than what you can get it for at Rock Auto, a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years with prices that are reliably low for every customer. Go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box so you know that we sent you? Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. Thanks again for making the Locked On Bucs podcast your first listen or view every single day. Looks like Jimmy Garoppolo and Tom Brady may get to see each other again a little bit more than they expected to this season. That's according to Ian Rappaport, NFL insider for NFL Network, appearing on the Pat McAfee podcast. So shout out to James. We're talking Pat McAfee, even though James isn't here to talk Pat McAfee. So something for the brand, according to James Yarcho. Anyway, Ian Rappaport was asked about Jimmy Garoppolo during his appearance, and Ian said, quote, "The only team right now who seems to wants to be in the mix for trading for a quarterback that we know is the Carolina Panthers. So they would be the team that makes sense," end quote. Now, it's important to note, Ian Rappaport doesn't say the Panthers are looking at Jimmy G or talking to the Niners about Jimmy G or anything like that. Just says that the only team right now that they know of who could be in the mix for trading for a quarterback is the Carolina Panthers. Of course, Baker Mayfield is another name out there, but so is Jimmy Garoppolo. Again, conflicting reports. Some people talking about Trey Lance may not be ready yet, so the Niners that might actually want to keep him. Or Baker Mayfield may be cooling a little bit on his anger with the Cleveland Browns decided to stay, especially if Deshaun Watson's suspension actually ends up being a full year, like a lot of people are expecting. Either way, when you're looking for a quarterback, Garoppolo hasn't thrown in 4 months, which again, Rappaport points out as well. But we also know Garoppolo has not thrown a football in 4 months because he had offseason shoulder surgery after the Niners were eliminated from the playoffs, from the postseason by the Los Angeles Rams. Garoppolo also entering his final year of his current contract, in which he's set to hit the salary cap for $26.95 million, so almost $27 million in 2022. Now, the Carolina Panthers do have $25.06 million in cap space, so could relatively easily absorb that cap hit. Would have to kind of restructure something. Ian Rappaport mentions maybe giving him a new deal, extending him out a couple of years. You move some of that money to future years, however you need to do it. Or, and here's an idea, this is just me kind of spitballing when I looked at the Carolina Panthers and their roster situation, their salary cap situation. Maybe you move Sam Darnold to the 49ers in exchange for Jimmy Garoppolo. Maybe it's not a 1-for-1 deal. Maybe the Niners say, hey, look, Sam doesn't look like a future quarterback for an NFL franchise either. Any more than Jimmy G does. Definitely not as much as Jimmy G does, I would argue. So you're going to have to give us picks and you'll give us Sam Darnold, but we'll take that. Sam Darnold on the books this year for $18.85 million against the cap. All of that is cap saving for the Panthers. No dead money if they trade him here post June 1st. So if you send Sam Darnold to the Niners, then you free up $18.85 million. You absorb Jimmy Garoppolo's $26.9 million. You net, there's still about a $6 million gap in there, $6 to $8 million cap in there. So you're good cap wise. You don't even have to make any other moves. But what if the Carolina Panthers also send Christian McCaffrey? I mean, that's been a rumor, right? That running back Christian McCaffrey may be available for a deal. And perhaps the Carolina Panthers look to send him to San Francisco in order to kind of curb some of the draft capital. Now, San Francisco, pretty good, right? I mean, Elijah Mitchell, they've got Deebo Samuel, who potentially could do something. I mean, there's a lot going on there. So I don't know if they would be all that interested in Christian, especially to negate draft capital. I think maybe you might want to take draft capital instead. I don't know, but just spitballing some ideas out there. At a minimum, the Panthers get San Francisco to take Sam Darnold, gets them off their hands. And they get to clear $18.5 plus million off their cap while absorbing the almost $27 million hit that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to bring them. They have a starting quarterback for this year, maybe even for next year if they so choose, and they continue to develop their young guys or maybe even go after somebody in the draft. We'll see. Currently, the Carolina Panthers quarterback depth chart looks like this. Sam Darnold is your assumed starter. Matt Corral out of Ole Miss. He had some first-round buzz coming into the 2022 NFL draft, ends up sliding with the rest of those quarterbacks. Matt Corral goes in the third round, again, to the Carolina Panthers. Some people talk about maybe Matt Corral unseats Sam Darnold as a starter here in his rookie season. That would be pretty impressive for Matt Corral. Not so impressive, obviously, for Sam Darnold. But if Jimmy G is there, I think Jimmy G is obviously your starter. Matt Corral, probably backup. PJ Walker, a guy who's been around a little while. And then Davis Cheek, an undrafted rookie quarterback out of Elon to wrap up the Carolina Panthers quarterback depth chart there. Now, Garoppolo, for those who don't remember, was thought at one point to be the successor to Tom Brady back in New England when they were there together. But eventually he was traded to the San Francisco 49ers before the 2017 season. There are some stories, some reports and all this of Tom Brady didn't like that Jimmy G was there. Bill Belichick, actually probably wanted to move on from Tom Brady earlier than they actually did. Eventually, Tom Brady essentially forced the issue and Jimmy G had to be dealt against Bill Belichick's wishes. At the time, Jimmy Garoppolo had been in the NFL for 3 years already, and it turns out to be another 3 years before Brady would even leave New England. So Jimmy G would have been in the NFL for 6 years, sitting behind Tom Brady if he stayed in New England. Instead, Jimmy G goes to San Francisco. He ended up on like a 7-0 run, I think, his first season there. something like that, or heads there in the 2017 season, whatever it was. If Jimmy G stays in San Francisco, Brady will see him. Brady and the Bucs will see him anyway. Week 14 in San Francisco. Brady will finally go back to San Francisco, but not as a member of the Niners, obviously as a member of the Buccaneers. If Jimmy ends up in Carolina, then Tom Brady and the Buccaneers will see him week 7 in Charlotte and then in Tampa for week 17. So either way, Jimmy G, whatever team he plays for, if it's one of these two, they will see the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, Sam Darnold has 4 years in the NFL. Comparing the two quarterbacks through their first 4 seasons. And again, Jimmy G had to sit behind Tom Brady for a bit. So Jimmy G had the better completion percentage, had the better yards per attempt, and a better interception rate. But Darnold so far has a better touchdown rate through his first 4 seasons versus Garoppolo. Last season, 2021, Garoppolo had a nearly 10% advantage in completions, almost 1,300 more yards through the air, 11 more touchdowns, and 1 fewer interception. So safe to say that Jimmy Garoppolo certainly would be an improvement at the quarterback position, you imagine, over a guy like Sam Darnold. Not the best quarterback in the NFL, but certainly not the worst. You could do a lot worse than Jimmy Garoppolo. I think the big question for the Carolina Panthers is you bring in a guy like Jimmy Garoppolo. He's obviously not the quote unquote future of your franchise for, forever, but he's going to do well enough. I think he's going to win you enough games, I think, with the guys that you have, that you're not going to be probably top 3, top 5, right? Draft position. You're probably going to be more towards like 10 to 15 range, which is going to take you out of contention for one of the top quarterbacks in next year's draft, which means you have to move up if you want to go get one of those guys and expend more draft capital than you have to get. And then you're compounding that because the draft capital you have to give up to get Garoppolo in the first place. Now you're adding it to the draft capital. Or if you're David Tepper, do you want to just cut your losses, roll with Sam Darnold, maybe even trade Sam Darnold for a 7th if you can get it? Go with Matt Corral. If he turns out to be a flameout, then you are probably looking at a top 3, top 5 draft pick. Maybe you have to move up a couple spots, 2 or 3 spots, but it's going to cost you significantly less in draft capital than the other alternative. I don't know. It's kind of a rock and a hard place type of thing. David Tepper is the kind of owner that kind of wants to win now. Matt Rule has every reason under the sun to try to win now. So it'll be interesting to see how the Carolina Panthers quarterback situation unfolds because, again, rookie camp, mini camp, OTAs, all those things are in the books. Whatever quarterback were to come in, they're going to start learning this playbook and this language and these calls and these checks from scratch and their teammates in training camp. So it's going to be a fairly difficult situation for any quarterback if they bring one in. So some news involving Jimmy Garoppolo, a division rival there with the Carolina Panthers. Interesting to see what happens there. But turning our attention back solely to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 2 veteran cornerbacks may not be on this roster at the end of training camp, according to ESPN's Jenna Laine, and supported by BucsGameDay.com's Dustin Lewis. We're going to talk about that next here on the Locked On Bucs podcast. All right, guys, final segment here on the Locked On Bucs podcast. Ross Cockrell and Rashard Robinson may be in danger of missing the cut for the Buccaneers roster this training camp season. That, according to roster projections by ESPN's Jenna Laine. Jenna Laine, you're a beat reporter covering the Buccaneers for ESPN on the ground there in Tampa, and supported by the further analysis of Bucs Game Day's own Dustin Lewis. At this time, Laine's latest predictions or predictions so far for the active roster: undrafted defensive back D. Delaney makes the roster. Former undrafted defensive back, right? D. Delaney makes the roster over Ross Cockrell and Rashard Robinson. And Laine mentions that Logan Ryan provides enough versatility to soak up snaps at nickel if absolutely necessary. Laine predicts the 5 cornerbacks on the team to beat: Carlton Davis, Sean Murphy-Bunting, and Jamel Dean. Of course, Zion McCollum, the 2022 draft pick, and D. Delaney is the 5th guy. Laine writes, quote, Delaney edges out Ross Cockrell and Rashard Robinson for the 5th cornerback spot after a very strong spring. Safety Logan Ryan can back up Murphy-Bunting at nickel. End quote. Dustin Lewis for BucsGameDay.com, he wrote this up and he wrote, it simply might not be worth keeping either player around after Delaney's strong stint this spring. Delaney recorded 17 tackles, 2 pass deflections, and his first career interception with the Buccaneers last year. If he can continue to perform when camp starts, he has a good opportunity to shore up that roster spot. End quote. And yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm not going to lie, I'm going to have to give myself the L on this because James isn't here to do it for me, but I know he would be very upset if I wasn't forthcoming and transparent with all of you guys in admitting that, yes, last year, my bold prediction coming into the season was that Ross Cockrell was going to be the defensive back that had the most interceptions in 2021. I was all on the Ross Cockrell train. I was all about the hype and everything. His sister was competing in the Olympics. It's all about it. Obviously, it did not come to fruition, and so Ross Cockrell now finds himself on the old dreaded roster bubble. James and I, of course, will be making our own active roster, final initial active roster predictions as we do every season. But some early looks there. This one coming from Jenna Laine. Looking through the rest of Laine's projections. She does have the Buccaneers carrying 4 running backs: Leonard Fournette, Rachaad White, Keyshawn Vaughn, and Giovanni Bernard. Wide receivers, she's got them taking 7. And what's interesting here, obviously, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Russell Gage, Cyril Grayson is on there, Scotty Miller, Brashad Perryman. Devin Tompkins is the 7th wide receiver, who is interesting because he's the guy that Todd Bowles mentioned. He's looking very, very much forward to seeing in training camp. Grayson, and this is what Laine writes, quote, Grayson makes the roster over Tyler Johnson because of his physicality and rapport with Brady. Jalen Darden's chemistry with Brady improved, but was still too inconsistent, and Tompkins, an undrafted free agent who both singled out after mandatory minicamp, wins the final spot over Darden because of his special teams return ability. He ran a 4.35 40-yard dash at his Utah State Pro Day, end quote. So Tyler Johnson and Jalen Darden both missing out on Jenna Laine's roster projections. It's going to be really interesting to see how that wide receiver position really does project. Tight ends, they're keeping all 4 there. Offensive line, not a whole lot of surprises. Defensive line, not a whole lot of surprises either. Cam Gill joins Anthony Nelson as the backup outside linebackers. KJ Britt and Grant Stewart stick on the roster as the 4 inside linebackers, the 2 behind Devin White and Levante David. We just talked about the corners. And then, of course, the safeties, you pretty much had that solidified. Winfield Jr., Mike Edwards, Logan Ryan, and Keanu Neal. Not a whole lot of surprises there either. So a few surprises on the roster projection there from Jenna Laine of ESPN.com. Again, Dustin Lewis of BucsGameDay.com supporting at least some of those takes. Wide receiver, man, that's going to be an interesting one, something that we will, of course, talk about more as we get deeper into this offseason, this period of rest for the players and the coaches, unrest for football fans, as you guys anticipate training camp, the preseason, then, of course, the regular season. It's going to be here before you know it, guys, so hold on tight because we're going to get going. Until then, we want to thank you for making the Locked On Bucs podcast your first listen or your first view of the day. Now make your second listen or view the Locked On NFL podcast. Our national NFL experts and insiders keeping fans dialed in with the biggest stories and the latest news from around the league, because an offseason doesn't equal a break in the action. James and I will be back after the 4th of July weekend. So the next time we're going to talk to you guys outside of any major breaking news will be Wednesday. So if you're out and about, please be safe. Enjoy your 4th of July weekend. If you got questions or topics that you want us to discuss, send them in to lockedonbucspodcast@gmail.com or call in and be a part of the show by dialing 813-444-5841. For James Yarcho, I'm David Harris. Until we speak again, make sure you're checking out everything that we are writing. I am over at BucsGameDay.com, James at BucsNation.com. Of course, you can find us on Twitter. I'm at DHarrison82. James is at JYarcho_Bucs. And the show is at Locked On Bucs. If you're out and about, please be safe. Be kind to one another. Wash your hands. Fire those cannons and safely fire those fireworks. And we thank you for joining us right here at Locked On Bucs.